Imagine walking into a classroom of 25 kids under the age of 7 who can't read, who have first-time parents, and who didn't bring a coat out for outside recess. This is the true story of one of my interviewees today that we'll be discussing. My point today with these interviewees is to inform my audience about communication barriers in education between teacher-student relationships and teacher-parent relationships by presenting practical solutions to promote understanding and stronger relationships in the education industry. Now, as a sophomore education student at the University of Findlay studying middle childhood education, focusing on English, language arts, and social studies, I have a lot to learn. However, with being a 2-year substitute teacher, a lifeguard, and the oldest sister of 4, I can confidently say I've spent a lot of time working and communicating with children and parents, though I do have a lot to learn compared to some of our interviewees today that we'll be talking about. So today we'll be talking about the 2 major communication issues that are prevalent in education today. First, teacher-student relationships. These are very crucial. Obviously, it's the main form of communication in education. And teacher-parent relationships. These can often get very tricky. So we'll be talking about them both today. First, one-on-one student-to-teacher communication. Now, the big thing among both my interviewees is that they said every student is different. This is the key to one-on-one communication with students and building that, recognizing there's not one universal way that it all can work. Now, Dr. Teeple, my first interviewee, she is an assistant professor of education at the University of Findlay, focusing on primary education, specifically science. She talked about technology, the arts, and English language arts. She also worked at the Mazza Museum at Findlay for 8 years. So quite a bit of a resume there. Her main communication preference today that she discussed was multimodal communication. Now, if some of you don't know what this means, it means using different modes of communication for speaking with students. So, for example, in a lecture class, you might have, a hands-on activity. You might have a slideshow to look at. You'll have the teacher talking. You'll have maybe a notepad to write notes, or a video on the board or an image. There's so many different ways of communicating with students, multimodally. So by doing that, students are seeing, they're hearing, they're understanding, and they're using all those different ways of learning through communication. So multimodal is huge, and that's something that she talked about. Now, this is backed with research. Dr. Derek Sean talks about, and he says, teacher clarity behaviors refer to the instructor's use of nonverbal messages and cues such as underscoring main ideas, rewording, providing examples, illustrations, and visuals to aid students' comprehension. So, one issue in one-on-one student communication is the language barrier. One situation that Dr. Teeple talked about was having Japanese students in her class. I guess this happened one time, and it was a little bit tricky for her because the group, yes, they could speak English, but the accents were a little bit difficult. So it wasn't so much the students understanding the teacher, but the teacher understanding the students. Being able to have that formative assessment was a little bit hard to understand when you can't quite understand what the students are saying. So that is definitely something that could be fixed. She talked about repeating questions of understanding to get a gauge for that, and I think that helps. Also, age-specific. Middle school, there's a lot of different, funny jokes and lingo and accents there, such as, for example, 6, 7. Dr. Teeple talked about, you about have to know it as a middle school teacher, or it'll just seem like to students that you don't care. Her biggest quote was, if you don't understand their language, you are inadvertently communicating to them that you don't care much about what they care about. And, it's silly, but if they care about 6, 7, you need to care about 6, 7 too, to be able to build that relationship and communicate with them effectively through emotional ways, behavioral ways, and just having them in class wanting to learn from you. So that's key in communication to fix the education industry. Now, for Mrs. Meyer, my second interviewee, she's the one I was talking about earlier, the preschool teacher. She, with those crazy students who can't read, before that, she began as Miss Ohio, the top of the communication, industry. She was taking interviews nationally, being a keynote speaker, hosting breakout sessions, and more. I mean, she was on the front page all the time. And switching from speaker to listener is something that she did when she came into education. As a teacher, you are speaking a lot, but you're also learning a lot and listening to students to get that assessment. And she spent quite a few years as a preschool teacher and lead director of St. Paul Lutheran Schools preschool program. And now she is an educational aide at Patrick Henry Local Schools. So she has spent quite a bit of time in communication. So her preference is similar to Dr. Teeple's with multimodal. She talked about different ways of communication: auditory, visual, verbal and nonverbal, writing written notes such as Post-it notes to communicate with others quickly, and more. So for language barriers, one thing that she has to do as an educational aide is work with ELLs, English language learners. So one thing that has actually come in mind, which you wouldn't think about, is using your high school math background. Now, most of us have taken 2 or 3 years of high school Spanish, just like Mrs. Meyer, and that paid off as an educational aide for her now. Working with Spanish-speaking students, just knowing even little bits of Spanish can help you communicate with them. But as teachers, many of them don't know any Spanish, so that really prevents us from being able to communicate with them and teach. There are some Spanish translating technologies that are there to make copies and translate papers into Spanish, but they're not perfect. And obviously, working with someone through paper is not the same as auditory and some of the other modes that we talk about. So this is crucial to get fixed. Another thing, age-specific, she talked about with her students, some of them can't read, some of them don't know how to express themselves. So for her, she had a chart of faces where students can either point to the face with a sad face, a happy face, frustrated face, depending on how they feel, because, when you can't read, it's hard to be able to communicate your emotions in an effective way. And that's something that she taught them as a speaker.